It is Tarot Tuesday again. Today, I'm going to talk about the number 20 card, the Judgment card, which is a big scary one for me, has been for a long time. Partly because of my Christian upbringing and having read the book of Revelations at a really young age. Partly about the same age. I remember I was 8 years old, third grade. I know exactly where I was living. My parents hired this babysitter. She was a Jehovah's Witness teenager, and she practiced proselytizing on me. And if you've ever followed any of the narrative or storytelling from Jehovah's Witness, they're pretty much fire and brimstone. There's only a select number of people getting into heaven, and everyone else is getting into hell. And this shook me up when I was a kid because I was afraid of what was going to happen to my eternal soul. And so we're going to dig into the Judgment card today on Tarot Tuesdays, and I'm also going to talk about something special that I haven't talked about before at the end of the video, and that's the nature of clairvoyance. So you want to stick around and make sure you watch to the end so that you can get a little bit of my insights into some of these spiritual gifts like clairvoyance and how it applies to the Judgment card itself. My name is Shannon Douglas. It's Tarot Tuesdays, and today the Judgment card, number 20. I've already touched on a little bit about this end times. If you were raised in a Christian household and you did your confirmation classes, whether it was in Anglican or Catholic or Lutheran or whatever your tradition happened to be, and you at some point went to church on Sundays, part of the recitation is that you acknowledge that Jesus is going to come back to life someday, and there's going to be a resurrection of the dead. Some practices believe in the resurrection of the body, judgment from God, and then a determination on the nature of your soul, whether it's going to live forever in heaven or whether you're going to go to hell. And the Judgment card really depicts this. We get stories like Michael at the pearly gates, the archangel Michael, St. Peter, Stuart Kaplan, who is the owner and founder of U.S. Game Systems, published dozens, if not hundreds, of different tarot decks, wrote in his book on tarot that the angel figure up here in the Judgment card is Gabriel. I don't know if that's true, but the whole card conjures images and archetypes of this Christian judgment, elevation to heaven or damnation. And it points out to us or raises for us an internalization of moral behavior that we have been raised with, so that if you don't comply with the external rules, the commandments, and the judgments or the determinations of Christian tradition, you don't act in accordance with them and commit sins, then you'll go to hell. Now, Jesus was famous for saying, and one of his most famous expressions was, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Also, an interesting kind of prognostication. This is a little scary, and it sort of paints a much larger picture of the nature of this archetype than just the self. As I've been reflecting on this, it occurred to me that this nature of judgment, the book of Revelations, the second coming of Jesus, the physical resurrection from the dead, is not dissimilar from the stories of Santa Claus. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake, right? This notion of an external force or being or benchmark for proper behavior is coded into the religious traditions, and it has helped us as societies over time to internalize that right practice. But there comes a time in an individual's life where we no longer believe in Santa Claus. And we need to be able to make judgments for ourselves as opposed to being concerned about a divine other's judgment on ourselves. And we actually have this normal function of self-awareness and self-reflective capacity so that we can judge our own behavior. Now, as we've been going through the major arcana so far, especially in the last few weeks, we've gone through some major milestones. We went through the 13 card, death, the end of a way of being. 14 is temperance, hammered, hot and cold, shaped and molded by extreme experiences, strengthened and focused and centered. The 15 card, the devil, the dysfunctional ego attachments, addictions. The tower card, number 16, which is our ego collapsing if it's not fit to stand in the eyes of God, is kind of how I put that. And then we get to the 17 card, which is the star. So after the ego collapses, after we've recognized that we can't impose this egoic will upon the world, and the ego collapses, we get into this positive omen in the 17 card, the star. And then we get into the nature of the intuition and the unconscious mind and the structure of the unconscious, and a promise of a more enlightened connection to the divine between the two pillars that are shown in the number 18 card. And then the sun is our day in the sun. It's our true nature of spirit and soul, that unabashed expression of being, like a baby fully embodying a giggle, or like an athlete in pure flow in a game 7 of a series, or performing at their highest level and completely immersed in this peak kind of performance and experience. And then we get to the Judgment card. And it seems to me like the Judgment card is rehashing a number of different structures from earlier in the major arcana. And when we get into this notion of judge not lest you be judged, we get into this mirror, this hall of mirrors thing that I've talked about before, the Jungian notion of shadow projection or ego and shadow dynamics, where we project our deficiencies onto other people and perceive that it's them that's behaving that way when it's actually our own stuff. So judgment, in alignment with this developmental process through the arcana, because that's what the major arcana is. It's a developmental process through several different layers, numerous different layers of the psyche, their psychic events and transformation as we grow up and grow older. And last week in the Sun card, which you can connect to here if you want to review it again, I talked a little bit about developmental psychology and moving from one stage of the ego dynamic to the next in our journey as human beings. Now, that sounds fancy and all of that, but I want to talk about this in really practical terms. When a child is born, it has a framework of reference. It comes out of the embeddedness with the mother, and the being one in the mother's womb with the mother. And then in the first couple of years, we go through a process of being attached to mother and separate. We go through attachment versus separation. We go through this test of trust and security in the world, in our relationship with mother and family. If we think about this in terms of tarot, we're talking about the magician and the high priestess, the mother and father archetypes. And our ego starts to express itself in the terrible twos when we start to try and express power and individuality, and we test power against that in our environment, and we develop this relationship of power over versus cooperation, and then we go through another transformation where that structure of ego collapses, and then we get into an understanding of sharing and being part of a family and being able to start to perceive other people's feelings and thoughts and needs as opposed to just our own. So we're getting into age 4, 5, 6 years old, 7 years old, starting to be able to see ourselves as distinct from the world around us and other people, and recognize other people have needs and feelings, and that they exist in the world without us being involved. When we're a little bit younger, the psychologists call this object permanence. If a young child is playing with a ball, and you take the ball and you put it in your hand, for the child, the ball ceases to exist. This has been proven in psychological studies. And we have these numerous stages of development. And when we get into our teens, what Piaget called concrete operational thinking, or operations, we start to not only perceive others outside of ourselves, but we start to be able to imagine what they think. We start to be able to have empathy and put ourselves in their shoes. And we play games. Do you think she likes me? Does he like me? And we start to try and figure out how other people are operating and thinking. And then we start to get into, oh my God, he must think that, or she must think that, or what do they think of me? And we start to get into this mirror game of judgment. And as we're trying to navigate and figure out how other people perceive us and how we should be perceived within our social and our community context, we identify with our peer groups, and we start to figure out judgment. And as we start to do that, we start to develop, through that developmental process, feelings like guilt. Guilt is an emotion of the past. It's a judgment that we have of ourselves for a behavior in the past that we carry with us. And I don't know about you, but there's still a couple of things that if I remember from when I was young, my cheeks get hot. I start to sweat a little bit. I feel embarrassment. I feel a self-judgment happening. So when we're exploring this idea of judgment, in the position card of the number 20, we are, and we're in the second half of the major arcana, we're well into or down the road of these multiple stages of our psychological and psychic development. And the ego has fallen away in a number of different times, as it has to. The tower has to fall every time we make a transition from one stage of psychological development to the next. And as I said last week, there are at least 2, probably 3 or more developmental stages in adulthood beyond what we have traditionally viewed as stages of development in developmental psychology. And so when we're thinking about the judgment card, we're looking backwards on an old ego structure, a previous self. And you notice the figures in the foreground of the card are corpse-like. They're gray or monochromatic, and clearly they appear to be dead people rising from a boat or coffins or something like this. Years ago, I did a personal development workshop, and the facilitator said, are you going to embrace your life, or are you going to be like the rest of the walking, breathing dead people? Well, there comes a point in that developmental process where judgment falls away, where we're no longer concerned with what other people think. We move past that reference of peer group, and we move into the individuated self. And we are self-reflective, and we measure ourselves against ourselves instead of ourselves against a social sort of measuring stick or yardstick, or what the social mirror is going to reflect back to us in terms of our behavior. The philosopher Nietzsche said that the first key to greatness, or one of the first keys, is to forget what other people think about you. And this is a natural part of a certain developmental stage that people can achieve. Now, not everybody achieves this, because I know plenty of adults who are fixated still with what other people think of them, and also consumed with their own beliefs and opinions about other people around them. So they're playing that mirror game of judgment, and stuck in that social mirror stage of existence. after people have a pop, like a significant pop, and we're into one of the 2 or 3 or maybe more developmental stages in adulthood, and the higher ones, I'm going to say, are tied into wisdom and clarity of vision, and a perception of our place in the psychic fields that we exist in. It ceases to become important what other people think. And there are so few people who operate in that space or that sphere. I remember after I had a significant pop like that, I'd been contemplating a number of different spiritual questions in my own life and working with traditional Indigenous elders, and had talked with many of them. I traveled through Western Canada and the United States, and even where I live now in what is historically, traditionally Anishinaabe territory, Algonquin people. I met a number of traditionals here, and it's a bit like a culture shock. I mentioned a friend of mine who'd spent months in South and Central America, and he came back to the world that we live in, and he was like, I don't fucking care what color the drapes are. Why are all these people here so consumed with all of this stuff when this truth, this light, this purpose, this meaning is so much more important? And a person at that stage of existence or development who either achieves that as a semi-permanent state, or has an awakening vision of that informs them, and then they kind of revert back down, which happens frequently. We have a peak experience and then we settle back in. There are times in that peak experience when you look out at the world around you and everybody looks like a walking, breathing dead person. Now, I said I was going to talk a little bit about clairvoyance, and I haven't talked about psychic abilities or perceptions or reading or divination even through this process of exploring tarot. Clairvoyance just means clear seeing. And clear seeing can only happen when the ego has fallen, when our addictions have fallen away, when all of the attachments that we have, that internal judgment, all those binds of energy that we have as human beings are either transcended or they're released, and that energy is gone, so that we can channel pure grace. Let's say, I'll borrow the word from Carolyn Mace, to live in grace and to be able to have a symbolic sight. Clairvoyance is being able to either get into that state of clear seeing, or to be at a stage of development where none of these other sort of mirror on the wall things are affecting us. None of the ego attachments that we have are impairing or clouding our judgment, and we can just look at the world objectively and see it for what it is. And I met a talented seer and reader many years ago, and I've met a few in my life, and she said, you know, most of the time we read people based on their fears. So if we're reading somebody, the easiest things to see are the schisms and the traumas and the delusions and the fears and the misperceptions. It's much more difficult to see the purity of their spirit and to see their spirit guides. And I don't know if that's true or not, but when she said it, it really resonated with me. And I've had that experience of state where after a big pop, an awakening, or moments of clarity or periods of clarity where it seemed like, looking around the world, all I could see is people caught up in their fears and their binds and their sins and their attachments and their egos and their desires and their addictions. And if we look at the world, now I talked about developmental perspective, right? At a certain point, we start to be able to judge the world for ourselves. But at lower levels or earlier levels of development, we're judging based on the social mirror, Well, when we get to higher levels of development, we're able to look objectively and say, how would a third party view me and this person in a relationship? Or how could we view objectively from perhaps the viewpoint of the angel Gabriel here, or if we're willing to say that this is St. Peter, how can we, what would this figure and how would this figure see the circumstances? And it's very interesting what happens when the mind goes quiet. When we can look at the world objectively, recognize that most people are going through their struggles, dealing with their own sins and their traumas, and are burdened by the weight of that and attached to earthly things. And at some point, perhaps people are going to wake up en masse. I think that's more mythology than anything. But it raises... These are the thoughts that I've had as I've considered the notion of judgment. So what is the nature of sin? I had a conversation with a kahuna, a master of Hawaiian huna, probably 15 or 18 years ago, who described the nature of sin to me. The only real sin is one where an individual would intentionally undermine the mana and purpose of someone else, to exploit someone deliberately. There's all kinds of things that we do out of ignorance or at certain stages of our lives and developmental levels that we would look back on today and say, well, we wouldn't do that. That's immoral. I remember I don't know, I was maybe in grade 9, maybe grade 10. And for some reason, I stole something from somebody I knew. And I justified it at the time. But the brain isn't fully developed at that moment. And it wasn't until years later that I recognized the implications of this. And even though I knew intellectually that stealing was bad, I didn't recognize the consequences of it until afterwards. And then as we go through different levels of development, we can recognize, okay, well, I didn't really know any better at the time. My framework for thinking about these things from a moral perspective wasn't fully fleshed out. And I was kind of operating from a deficient perspective, and deficient only meaning that my brain wasn't fully formed yet and I couldn't really understand the consequences of my actions. And so we have to recognize in ourselves and recognize in our kids, if we're raising kids, that at certain ages and stages we do certain things that from a more developed stage of life look maybe not so good. But if we hold our kindergarten self to the same standards as our adult self and we judge that child, our inner child, based on these modern elevated developed standards, we do harm to ourselves. And we need to be able to forgive ourselves. At a certain level of development, it ceases to become less about what God thinks about us and how we hold things internally. Now, I've talked a little bit about justice. And justice, the number 11 card, 1 and 1 is 2. We're at the 20 card, 2 and 0, 2. Numerologically, these are a separate scale. Justice and judgment are correlated together. But justice has to do with internal balance. And judgment has to do with our perception of ourselves. There's a whole ton of stuff here. It's such a big subject. I'm going to talk more about clairvoyance in another video, I think, because there's a lot of layers to an aura, for example. There's a lot of layers to clairvoyance. These, in Hindu tradition, they call them Siddhis. These spiritual gifts can manifest themselves after we've been through some developmental stages and released some lower orders of bound energies, and different spiritual gifts can and present themselves. Precognition, precognitive dreams, clairvoyance, the ability to see auras, the ability to have clairsentience, or be able to feel what others are feeling clearly, deep empathy, clairaudience, to be able to hear spirit or hear voices, mediumship, to be able to connect with those who have passed on the other side, or the energy that remains here after those of us who have passed have left. It's not until we get past the devil and the tower collapses and we get through the dark night of the soul and the clarity that comes with that, where these things start to manifest themselves. And we can see, if we can take that perspective of the angel in the card, where we become the expression of our highest self, we start to be able to see the grayness and the dross of most of human existence and the suffering that's there, and to be able to see it as part of reality. That didn't come out as structured as I thought it was going to come out. I'd love to know what you think about this. Judgment is such a complicated one. In the workshop I told you about, I took part in this 20 odd years ago, and the facilitator who I mentioned, who talked about walking, breathing dead people, had created this workshop in partnership with Dr. Phil McGraw. This is in the mid-90s, before Phil McGraw met Oprah, before Dr. Phil had the TV show. And this whole life skills workshop was based on Dr. Phil's life strategies. And this frequent notion of, are you a walking, breathing dead person, or do you get it? By the time you get through the Sun card, you got it. And then when you turn the attention outwards from inwards and look at the world, you recognize just how much suffering there is in the world out there. And we can look at it objectively and dispassionately and recognize that people could use a whole lot of forgiveness. Now, the other side of judgment, we might say, is atonement or forgiveness, or the release from the pains of our sins. But I think more appropriately, and I'll finish with this, that the opposite of judgment is compassion. When someone starts, if you know judgy people, I grew up in a Lutheran household, so I know plenty of judgy people. Catholics are good at guilt, and I don't know, numerous traditions say that they're really good at some of these things. Lutherans are good at being judgy. And a person who is judgmental of other people is judgmental of them because they've stopped listening. They've made up their own conclusion about the way the world is. They've attached themselves to that illusion. This is who I think you are. Meanwhile, you're actually over here. I'm going to treat you like this image that I have in my own mind of you. I'm going to treat you like my own projection. And this creates a distance in reality, or from reality. The opposite of that is compassion, is to be able to see and relate to other people as they are, without worrying about how they should be, or how they're supposed to be, or how you think they're supposed to be, or measuring up against some milestone or yardstick or external measure. And to just be able to see, that 16-year-old is having a hard time. And they're going through normal developmental stuff, particularly social challenges for these reasons and those reasons. And that's part of life. That's part of a stage. And they're acting out not because they're a bad person or they lack moral character. It's just they're at a certain stage of life, and that's the way life is. And when we can see the world as it is, and have compassion for it, and recognize that we can only do the things in life based on the tools that we have, our best intentions, the stage of development that we have, that we're at, how much of our brain is actually formed, what sort of other forces inform the circumstance, then we don't actually need forgiveness. We can just see things as they are. Sometimes that's seeing the world as populated by a lot of walking, breathing dead people. My name is Shannon Douglas. This has been Tarot Tuesday. Got one more week to go. The World card is next week, and then I'm going to do a few high-level tarot videos. If you've got any subject that you'd like me to cover off, let me know in the comments. Any questions that you might have about tarot in general. And I'm going to loop back. I'm going to start with the Magician and the Priestess. I'm going to go through the first half a dozen cards or so. As I talk about the World next week, I'm going to tie in the Fool from the beginning of the journey because they're deeply connected. And then I think I'm going to be at a point where I'm going to have the whole major arcana and a map of tarot, which is something that I wanted to do before, well, as a lifetime project, let's say. I didn't want to leave this plane without having shared some of the things that I thought about and learned about and studied and have developed so much passion and interest for. See you next week.